Hollywood has always been obsessed with youth, with fresh faces and new talent, with the next big thing that will capture audiences' attention and make studios millions of dollars. By the early 1970s, this obsession had become an iron law of the industry, an unspoken rule that everyone understood and accepted without question. If you hadn't made it by 30, you probably never would. If you were still struggling at 40, it was time to accept reality and move on. And if you were over 50 and hadn't achieved stardom yet, you were finished, done, too old to matter, too old to be bankable, too old to carry a major motion picture on your shoulders. Charles Bronson was 52 years old in 1973 when Paramount Pictures was developing a controversial project called Death Wish, based on a novel by Brian Garfield about an architect whose family is brutally murdered by muggers, leading him to become a vigilante hunting criminals through the streets of New York City. The material was dark and violent and deeply controversial, touching on themes of urban decay and the breakdown of law and order and the fantasy of taking justice into your own hands. It was exactly the kind of film that made studio executives nervous, the kind of project that could either become a phenomenon or a complete disaster with very little middle ground between those extremes. Paramount wanted a star for the lead role, someone with name recognition who could open a film and draw audiences into theaters based on their presence alone. They started at the top of the list and worked their way down through every major actor in Hollywood who might conceivably play this role. They offered it to Jack Lemmon, who read the script and said absolutely not, too dark, too violent, not the kind of film he wanted to be associated with at this point in his career. They went to Robert Mitchum, who'd built his career playing tough guys and anti-heroes, figuring this would be right in his wheelhouse, but Mitchum passed as well, concerned about the vigilante message and what it might say about him as an actor. They approached Clint Eastwood, who seemed like the perfect choice given his work in westerns and his natural ability to play dangerous men, but Eastwood was already committed to other projects and didn't want to get involved in something this controversial. They tried Henry Fonda, they tried Frank Sinatra, they even floated the idea past Paul Newman, who actually laughed when his agent brought it up and said he'd rather retire than make a film glorifying vigilante violence. One by one, every major star in Hollywood either passed on the project outright or priced themselves so high that Paramount couldn't afford them. The studio was getting desperate because they'd already invested significant money in development and they needed to move forward or cut their losses entirely. That's when someone in a production meeting, probably not even a senior executive but just someone throwing out ideas to fill the silence, mentioned Charles Bronson almost as a joke. Bronson had been working steadily in Hollywood for over 20 years at that point, appearing in dozens of films, always in supporting roles, always playing the heavy or the sidekick or the tough guy who wasn't quite tough enough to be the lead. He'd been in The Magnificent Seven and The Great Escape and The Dirty Dozen, all successful films where he'd given memorable performances, but he'd never been the star, never had his name alone above the title, never been the guy who carried a major studio production. The executive response to Bronson's name being mentioned was predictable and almost unanimous. "He's too old," someone said immediately. "He's 52 years old, and leading men in action films are supposed to be in their 30s, maybe early 40s at most." Someone else pointed out that Bronson had never opened a film in America, that he wasn't bankable in the domestic market even though he developed a strong following in Europe, particularly in France where they seemed to appreciate something about him that American audiences hadn't fully discovered yet. A third executive noted that Bronson wasn't conventionally handsome, didn't have that leading man look that studios traditionally relied on to sell tickets, especially to female audiences who were considered crucial for any film's commercial success. But then someone else, possibly the same person who'd originally mentioned Bronson's name, said something that made everyone pause and reconsider. He pointed out that this character, Paul Kersey, isn't supposed to be a young hero, isn't supposed to be some action star in his physical prime. Kersey is an ordinary man, an architect in his 50s, someone who's lived a normal life and suddenly has it destroyed by random violence. The whole point of the character is that he's not special, not trained, not a natural warrior, just a regular person who gets pushed too far and transforms himself into something dangerous. For that to work, for audiences to believe it and connect with it emotionally, you need someone who actually looks like he's lived through life's disappointments and compromises, someone whose face shows experience and pain and the weight of years. Another executive added that Bronson's face, the face that had kept him from leading roles for 2 decades, that weathered, hardened, distinctly un-Hollywood face, might actually be perfect for this particular role. When audiences looked at Bronson, they believed he'd suffered, believed he understood loss and pain and what it felt like to be pushed beyond endurance. You couldn't fake that quality or manufacture it through makeup and performance. Either an actor had lived through real struggle or they hadn't, and Bronson clearly had. He looked like a man who'd been forged in fire, and that's exactly what Paul Kersey needed to be. The discussion continued for another hour, weighing the risks and potential benefits, but eventually the studio decided they didn't have better options available within their limited budget and tight schedule. They offered the role to Charles Bronson with genuine uncertainty about whether this 52-year-old character actor could carry a major studio release and make it commercially successful. They were essentially betting the entire project on a man who'd never proven he could open a film in the American market, who'd never been trusted with a lead role this significant, who by Hollywood's conventional wisdom was simply too old to become a star. When Bronson's agent called with the offer, Bronson was working on another film, playing another supporting role, doing exactly what he'd been doing for 20 years. His agent explained that Paramount wanted him for the lead in Death Wish, that his name would be above the title for the first time in his career, that this was the opportunity he'd been working toward for 2 decades. Bronson asked what the pay was, and when his agent told him the figure, Bronson was quiet for a long moment because it was more money than he'd ever been offered for a single film, more than he'd made in entire years earlier in his career. But Bronson didn't say yes immediately, which surprised his agent who'd expected him to jump at this opportunity without hesitation. Instead, Bronson asked for the script and said he wanted to read it carefully before making any decision because he'd learned over 20 years that not every role was worth taking regardless of the money or the billing. His agent sent the script over that same day, and Bronson read it that night in his hotel room, sitting alone with just a lamp and the pages and his thoughts about whether this was really the role he'd been waiting for. When he finished reading, Bronson sat in silence for a while, thinking about Paul Kersey and what this character represented. Kersey was a man who'd played by society's rules his entire life, worked hard, built a career, raised a family, believed in the system and in civilization and in the idea that if you did the right things, life would treat you fairly. And then in one horrific moment, everything he believed in was destroyed, his wife murdered, his daughter traumatized beyond recovery, his faith in human decency and social order shattered completely. The character's journey was about what happens when a civilized man is forced to become uncivilized, when someone who spent his whole life being reasonable discovers that reason has limits and sometimes violence is the only language that certain people understand. Bronson understood this character on a level that went deeper than acting technique or character analysis. He'd grown up in coal mining towns where violence was common and expected, where disputes were settled with fists or worse, where the official law often didn't reach and people made their own justice. He'd served in World War II, flying combat missions where the only thing that mattered was killing the enemy before they killed you, where all of civilization's rules were temporarily suspended in service of a larger goal. He'd spent 20 years in Hollywood being told he wasn't good enough, wasn't handsome enough, wasn't young enough, enduring rejection after rejection while watching lesser talents get opportunities he deserved based purely on how they looked rather than what they could do. Paul Kersey's transformation from civilized architect to dangerous vigilante wasn't just a fictional journey for Bronson. It was something he understood in his bones, the knowledge that beneath society's thin veneer of civilization, we're all capable of violence when pushed far enough, that the difference between a law-abiding citizen and a killer is often just one traumatic moment, one unbearable loss, one situation where the rules we've agreed to follow suddenly seem meaningless and insufficient. The next morning, Bronson called his agent and said yes, he would do Death Wish, not because of the money or the billing or the opportunity for stardom, but because he understood this character and believed he could make him real and authentic in a way that a younger, prettier actor never could. He understood what it meant to be civilized on the surface while carrying something dangerous underneath, and he knew how to show that duality on screen without overplaying it or making it melodramatic. Production began in late 1973, filming primarily in New York City on location in neighborhoods that were genuinely dangerous, where crime was rampant and law enforcement had essentially given up on maintaining order. Director Michael Winner insisted on this authenticity, on filming in the real streets where the real violence was happening, rather than recreating sanitized versions on Hollywood backlots. He wanted the film to feel raw and real and threatening, wanted audiences to feel the danger that Paul Kersey was walking into every night as he hunted criminals through these dark streets. Bronson approached the role with complete seriousness and commitment, understanding that this was probably his only chance to prove he could carry a major film as the lead actor. If Death Wish failed, if audiences rejected him or critics tore the film apart, he'd likely never get another opportunity like this. He'd go back to being a character actor for the rest of his career, always supporting someone else's story, never the center of his own. The pressure was enormous, but Bronson had learned over 20 years how to handle pressure and use it as fuel rather than letting it paralyze him. What made Bronson's performance so powerful and so different from what another actor might have done was his complete lack of showiness or performance flourishes. He didn't try to make Paul Kersey interesting or sympathetic or cool. He simply played him as a real man going through the worst experience of his life and finding something dark inside himself that he didn't know was there. When Kersey picked up a gun for the first time and went out into the streets looking for criminals to kill, Bronson didn't play it like an action hero finding his calling. He played it like a man doing something he knew was wrong but couldn't stop himself from doing because the alternative was living with unbearable pain and powerlessness. The scenes where Kersey hunts muggers through Central Park and subway stations aren't exciting or triumphant in Bronson's performance. They're sad and desperate and somehow inevitable, watching a civilized man systematically destroying his own humanity in pursuit of revenge that can never actually heal his wounds or bring back what he's lost. Bronson understood that the real tragedy of Paul Kersey isn't that his family was killed, but that he survives that loss by becoming someone he would have despised before tragedy struck. When Death Wish was released in July of 1974, the critical response was harsh and immediate, with many reviewers calling the film fascist propaganda that glorified vigilante violence and presented a dangerous fantasy of taking the law into your own hands. Some critics were so offended by the film's premise that they barely mentioned the performances at all, focusing entirely on what they saw as the movie's toxic message and harmful influence. The controversy was immediate and intense, with op-eds in major newspapers debating whether the film should have been made at all and whether theaters should refuse to show it on moral grounds. But while critics were busy being horrified and offended, something completely different was happening in theaters across America. Audiences were lining up to see Death Wish in numbers that shocked everyone, including Paramount executives who'd been nervous about the entire project from the beginning. The film opened strong, and instead of dropping off in its second week the way controversial films often do, it actually built momentum, with word of mouth driving more and more people to theaters to see what all the fuss was about. What audiences responded to wasn't the violence or the vigilante fantasy, or at least not primarily. What they responded to was Charles Bronson's face and presence and the authenticity he brought to every scene. They looked at him and believed this could be a real person, not some Hollywood fantasy hero but an actual man who'd been pushed beyond endurance and found reserves of strength and violence he didn't know he possessed. They believed his pain and his rage and his transformation because Bronson's entire life had prepared him to play this role with complete conviction and truth. Women in particular responded to Bronson in ways that surprised studio executives who'd been worried that his unconventional looks would alienate female audiences. But women saw something in Bronson's performance that went deeper than conventional handsomeness. They saw a man who'd loved his wife deeply and was destroyed by her loss, a man whose violence came from devotion rather than machismo, a man who was dangerous because he'd lost everything that made him want to be civilized and safe. That kind of passionate devotion and complete commitment was attractive in ways that traditional leading men often couldn't access because they were too concerned with looking cool and maintaining their star image. By the end of its theatrical run, Death Wish had earned over $22 million, an enormous sum in 1974 and far more than Paramount had projected even in their most optimistic scenarios. More importantly for Bronson's career, the film had proven beyond any doubt that he could carry a major release as the sole lead, that his name above the title could sell tickets and fill theaters, that audiences wanted to see him in leading roles regardless of what Hollywood conventional wisdom said about age and looks and star quality. The film's success changed everything for Bronson overnight in ways that 20 years of steady work never had. Suddenly, studios that had never considered him for leading roles were offering him star vehicles with his choice of directors and co-stars and significant creative control. Suddenly, he was being offered $1 million per film, a staggering amount in the mid-1970s that put him among the highest-paid actors in Hollywood regardless of age. Suddenly, at 52 years old, Charles Bronson had become one of the biggest action stars in the world, not just in America but globally, with his films performing even better in international markets than they did domestically. The irony wasn't lost on Bronson, who'd spent his entire career being told he wasn't leading man material and now found himself as one of the most bankable stars in the industry. When reporters asked him how it felt to finally achieve stardom after so many years of struggle and rejection, Bronson would typically shrug and say something modest about being grateful for the opportunity and lucky that the right role came along at the right time. But privately, with people he trusted, Bronson acknowledged that there was something deeply satisfying about proving wrong everyone who'd said he was too old or too ugly or too ethnic or too whatever else to be a star. He made 4 Death Wish sequels over the next 20 years, each one making substantial money even as critics continued to despise the series and everything it represented. He made dozens of other action films throughout the 1970s and 1980s, becoming so prolific and successful that at one point he was making more money per film than virtually any other actor in Hollywood regardless of age or conventional star power. The face that casting directors had called too ugly became iconic, instantly recognizable, the kind of face that audiences associated with strength and authenticity and the promise that justice would be served no matter how powerful the villains might be. But perhaps the most significant impact of Bronson's late career success was what it meant for the idea of age in Hollywood and who could be an action star. Before Death Wish proved otherwise, the industry had operated on the assumption that action heroes needed to be young, that audiences wouldn't accept or believe in a protagonist over 40 taking on physical challenges and dangerous situations. Bronson demolished that assumption completely, proving not only that audiences would accept an older action hero but that they might actually prefer someone who looked like they'd lived through real struggles and accumulated real experience. This opened doors for an entire generation of actors who might otherwise have aged out of leading roles. Clint Eastwood was able to extend his career for decades partly because Bronson had proven that audiences valued authenticity and gravitas more than youth and conventional good looks. Liam Neeson launched an entirely new phase of his career as an action star in his 50s with the Taken films, following a template that Bronson had established decades earlier. Denzel Washington, Keanu Reeves, and countless others have been able to play action heroes well into their 50s and even 60s because Charles Bronson proved at 52 that age could be an asset rather than a liability in these roles. In 1985, more than a decade after Death Wish had made him a star, Bronson was interviewed by a journalist who asked him directly about the period before his breakthrough, about those 20 years of supporting roles and constant rejection and being told he'd never make it as a leading man. The journalist wanted to know if Bronson had ever been tempted to give up, to accept that maybe the industry was right and he simply wasn't cut out for stardom, to settle for a career as a reliable character actor and stop hoping for something more. Bronson was quiet for a long moment before answering, and when he spoke, his response revealed something essential about his character and why he'd ultimately succeeded where others might have failed. He said he'd never seriously considered quitting because he'd survived worse things than Hollywood rejection, had endured poverty and war and genuine threats to his survival that made show business disappointment seem trivial by comparison. He'd learned early in life that you don't give up just because things are difficult or because people tell you you're not good enough. You keep working, keep improving, keep showing up every day, and eventually opportunities come to those who've prepared themselves to seize them. He also said something that revealed his perspective on age and timing and the industry's obsession with youth. He noted that if Death Wish had come along when he was 30 instead of 52, he probably wouldn't have been able to play Paul Kersey as effectively because he wouldn't have had the life experience and accumulated pain and understanding of loss that the role required. Being 52 wasn't a disadvantage for that particular role, it was actually essential, because you can't fake the weight of years and the knowledge of what it means to have life destroy your plans and assumptions. A younger actor could have performed the actions and said the lines, but only someone who'd actually lived through disappointment and rejection and the death of dreams could bring the authenticity that made audiences believe and connect with Paul Kersey's journey. This perspective on age and experience and readiness is perhaps the most valuable lesson from Charles Bronson's story. He didn't achieve stardom despite being 52. He achieved it because he was 52, because he'd accumulated 52 years of experiences and disappointments and small victories that had forged him into exactly the right person to play that particular role at that particular moment. All those years of rejection weren't wasted time or failures, they were preparation for the opportunity that would eventually come, building the skills and depth and authenticity that would make him perfect for a role that required someone who'd lived a real life rather than a Hollywood fantasy. There's a tendency to think of success as something that happens early or not at all, to believe that if you haven't achieved your goals by 30 or 40, you've somehow failed and it's time to lower your expectations and settle for something less than your dreams. Charles Bronson's career proves that this assumption is completely false. He was 52 when he finally got his shot at leading man status, 52 when he proved he could carry a major film, 52 when he became one of the highest paid actors in Hollywood. Not despite his age, but in many ways because of it, because he'd lived long enough and struggled long enough to bring something genuine and earned to his performances that younger actors simply couldn't match. The executives who'd said he was too old were looking at superficial qualities like physical appearance and energy levels and marketability to young audiences. What they failed to understand was that there's an audience for authenticity and experience and the kind of presence that can only come from actually living through struggle. Charles Bronson had that presence because he'd earned it through decades of real life, not through acting classes or studied technique but through actual experience of poverty and war and rejection and persistence. His success at 52 didn't just change his own career trajectory. It changed what was possible for everyone who'd been told they were too old or too late or had missed their window of opportunity. It proved that the right role at the right time can transform everything, regardless of how many years you've been working toward that moment. It proved that persistence and preparation and refusing to give up eventually create opportunities that might not even exist when you're younger and less experienced. So when people told Charles Bronson he was too old at 52 to become a leading man and action star, he didn't argue with them or try to change their minds with words. He simply took the role, did the work, brought everything he'd learned in 52 years of living to the performance, and let the results speak for themselves. And the results were so overwhelming and undeniable that Hollywood had to completely revise its assumptions about age and stardom and who could be an action hero. That's the real story of Death Wish and what it meant for Charles Bronson's career. Not a story about violence or vigilante justice or urban decay, but a story about what happens when someone who's been preparing for decades finally gets their opportunity and is ready to seize it with everything they've accumulated over all those years of struggle. A story about how being told you're too old can actually be the beginning of your greatest success if you refuse to believe the people who try to limit you based on arbitrary numbers and conventional wisdom. Charles Bronson was too old at 52 by Hollywood standards. Too old to become a star, too old to open a film, too old to transform the action genre and influence generations of actors who came after him. Except he wasn't too old for any of that. He was exactly the right age, with exactly the right experience, showing up at exactly the right moment with exactly the right role. And that's the lesson that transcends Hollywood and applies to anyone who's ever been told they're too late or too old or have missed their window. You're not too old. You're exactly the right age with exactly the right experience, and your moment is coming if you're patient enough and persistent enough and prepared enough to recognize it when it arrives.